Too many Christians are told that if church hurt shakes their faith, the problem is them, not the harm they've experienced. But what if that message is actually part of the problem, not the solution? Today, I want to tackle this and address this in our message today. So hit that like, share, subscribe, and stay tuned as we address this shaming culture within the Latter day Saint community. Hello, welcome everybody. This is Timothy Berman, your host for Faith and Reason, the new channel. Still approaching the doctrines and teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from a mindful perspective. However, I am rebranding this. So, welcome everybody. Hit that like, share, and subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comment section. Today, I want to talk about this particular meme. This meme right here because I have seen this over the years, I've heard it over the years, and we need to address this because too many Christians are told that if church hurt shakes their personal faith, the problem is them and not the very harm that they've experienced. However, what if this message is actually part of the problem? It is not the real solution. And so today I want to cut through the passive aggressive shame culture that shows up in both our Latter day Saint faith communities as well as those within the Protestant, Roman Catholic, and evangelical faith communities. And I want to talk about what real Christ like ministering looks like for people who've been wounded by the church or those who are church hurt. Now, before I get into this, I want to be very clear on this for you folks today. This video is meant for spiritual education, edification, and personal reflection and enrichment. This is not to substitute for any professional or legal counseling or guidance or mental health care. And some of the experiences that people have can be quite triggering. So, this may trigger some folks because if you are still dealing with the shame and the hurt because of betrayal, because of some form of offense, um, this message is for you, but it is also for everybody who is ministering to people who are brokenhearted, who are downtrodden, who feel that they don't belong in any type of faith based community. And so, if you've been harmed or are in an unsafe situation, please reach out to qualified professionals or trusted people in your life. My goal here is not to attack any person or denomination or faith. It is to validate real personal experiences, encourage healthy boundaries, and explore how we are able to minister the way Christ ministered with compassion, accountability, and spiritual integrity. Because the reality is we've got to face what needs to be addressed here. If a person walks away from church because they felt hurt, they felt betrayed, or they felt offended in some way, we tend to look at the problem that it is with them. And that's what this mean is, attempting to address. Okay. And so if somebody walks away from the church because they felt hurt, betrayed, or offended in some way, the problem is not their faith. It is our own personal failings to minister the way Christ has called us to minister. Being hurt is not a sign of weakness or a sign of a weak faith. It's often the real experience and the result of betrayal, exclusion, spiritual manipulation, or the misuse of even authority within faith communities claiming to represent Jesus Christ. When we dismiss a person's pain with passive aggressive catchphrase bumper sticker slogans, we are not defending God. We are avoiding accountability within our faith communities. And people are not leaving because they are fragile. They're leaving because they're wounded in a place that was supposed to be edifying, supposed to be encouraging, supposed to be uplifting, safe, and welcoming. Now, if we do not have honest and real conversations about this, we're not going to end the shaming culture that has permeated throughout our faith based communities. And so, this is why I'm bringing this up and why we need to start having conversations from lay perspectives as well as from pastoral and ecclesiastic perspectives. And from a Latter day Saint perspective, there are recent General Conference messages that have been quite clear on this. Our personal calling is to minister with compassion, validation, and genuine Christ like love. And leaders have repeatedly emphasized this. We are to listen without judgment. We are to make room for all people. We're to acknowledge real pain individuals experience. We are to minister in the way the Savior ministered, and we are to create a sense of belonging and not barriers. Now, this is quite the opposite of shaming the wounded. This is the genuine work of discipleship, of coming into unity of faith where we are edifying and encouraging one another, even to the point of esteeming others greater than ourselves. This is what the Apostle Paul wrote in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. When we validate somebody's experience, we are not excusing away any wrongdoing. What we are actually doing, folks, is that we're doing what Christ did himself. He never minimized the person's pain. He never blamed the wounded for bleeding. He walked with them, lifted them up, and restored them. If we truly want to minister to people and bring them into a place of healing and helping them overcome their hurts and their hangups, to find God and restore their faith or strengthen their faith, we ought to first show them his love through us and our ministering to their very needs. Essentially, we need to meet them in their spaces where they are at. And so this meme says it all, and it is quite harmful. Because if being hurt by the church causes you to lose faith in God, then your faith was in people, not God. So we need to call this statement out for what it is. It is passive aggressive. It is shaming. It is blaming the person who experiences real pain, real emotional distress because they were hurt, they were betrayed, they were ostracized, or whatever that they've had to deal with. This needs to stop, folks. We need to stop saying these bumper sticker catchphrase slogans. And what is even more um, concerning is that this meme came by a person who claims to be a doctor, and I came across this through a Facebook group that it was posted in that I oversee and minister, and it really caused such a great consternation for me because one, it's a personal issue with me, and two, I have spoken to people over the years with regards of this type of attitude and behavior where it is very dismissive of a person's real live experience of being hurt. And so it says, if being hurt by the church causes you to lose faith in God, then your faith was in people, not God. This quote sounds profound. It sounds tough. It sounds like spiritual wisdom. What it actually is, folks, is it's a form of spiritual bypassing because it is a way of avoiding personal accountability and responsibility, and it shifts the blame on to the wounded. And so I want to break this down why this message is harmful, why we need to eradicate this, and why we need to really confront and call out the blame and the shame culture that is surrounded by this ideology. And so, first, it invalidates real pain. Let's just get right to the root of the issue. It invalidates the real pain a person experiences. People don't get hurt by the church in the abstract sense. They get hurt by leaders. They get hurt by policies. They get hurt by cultures. They get hurt by communities. Because when we come into faith, when we come into fellowship, we want to be encouraged. In fact, the Apostle Paul, numerous times throughout his epistles, calls us to come into a unity of faith with one another, to mourn with those who are mourning, to encourage, to lift one another's up, greet one another's with a holy kiss, as he says in one epistle. When we say things like this to somebody who decides to have the courageous gumption to come to us and say, hey, this is what happened. And we say, well, the church is true and the church is perfect, but the people are not. What you just did was invalidate them, you dismissed them, and you've caused further wound and harm. And so it invalidates a person's real pain. The next thing it does is that it implies the wounded are spiritually immature. The message comes across as this: you wouldn't be struggling if your faith were stronger, or you need to get over it. You need to forgive them. We throw these blanket statements out, these cliches out. And the other one, the most common one that I just despise that we need to eradicate out of our vocabulary is the one that says, well, the church is true, the church is perfect, the people are not. And again, it's shaming. It's not discipleship. There's another layer to this. The third one is that it protects institutions instead of people. It protects institutional shaming culture instead of people who are experiencing hurt, who are experiencing pains and sufferings. because it shifts the conversation away from any personal accountability and shifts it back onto the person and blames them for having those experiences. It also directly contradicts the ministry of Christ. Jesus never told the bleeding woman, if you were stronger, you wouldn't be bleeding. He never told the woman caught in the throes of adultery that was brought before him and was facing impending death, where they took up stones to stone her. He bent down, wrote in the sand, and then when all the people left that accused her, he then looked at her and says, "Where are your accusers?" And she says, "There's nobody around." And he says, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." Christ met her where she was at and forgave her. And so it directly contradicts Christ's ministry and the fourfold mission of the church. Jesus never blamed people he ministered or healed. He validated them and restored them, meeting them where they were. And how is it that we're not doing the very same thing? And that is the question we need to ask ourselves on a personal level. So, what church hurt actually is? What constitutes church hurt that we need to address? Because in order to understand this, to address it, we need to define what it is. Now, according to Psychology Today, church hurt often falls under the broader category of spiritual abuse, which includes manipulation using scripture, it's shame based control, it's punishment for questioning, it's exclusion or ostracism, it's misuse of one's authority, and it's emotional or psychological harm. Now, Psychology Today notes that spiritual abuse may deeply damage a person's sense of identity, belonging, and relationship with the divine. This is not being offended. This is trauma. This is traumatic. And we don't seem to want to understand this. And so, church hurt is not a faith problem. It is a relational wound. When someone feels betrayed, offended, or even ostracized, the injury is quite relational and personal, and it affects their spiritual trust. And I want to give you an example of what I mean by this. And I've shared this before on my Sacred Sobriety Path for the Soul in various devotional messages that I've done. And I think I've shared it some on here as well. But there was a time in my life when I was outside of the LDS faith and I was attending an Assemblies of God church. In fact, I was actually a custodian that worked for the church as well as attending it. And at the time when my father was alive, I had a phone conversation with him. I don't remember what it was. I don't remember what was said. All I remember to this day was that he said things to me that broke me. It broke me emotionally, and it broke me um to the point that I was fighting back tears. And so I was in a space of emotional distress and hurting. And when people noticed that, one I was asked what's going on, and I mentioned that I just got off the phone with my father and shared how it was upsetting and everything else like that. And one person, I kid you not, said the worst thing you can ever say to somebody in a state of emotional distress. Well, I don't envy you. Now, I know he wasn't meaning to be malicious in that. I know he wasn't meaning to be, putting down, but how does that come across to somebody who is emotionally distressed, emotionally hurting, and on the verge of tears, and they're fighting back and they're trying to process what was said to them from their very own father? And it doesn't have to be a person's father, it could be any person. You're adding more harm than good in meeting people with that. And that threw me in even further into the throes of emotional distress to the point that I had to separate myself. I walked out, I sat down on the church steps. I allowed myself to cry because I was in that emotional distress. Now, here's where my personal story takes a different turn. And this is the reason why I share this, because it gives you the example of what not to do, as well as it gives you the example of what we can do when somebody is hurt by the things that people say or do. And again, like I said, I don't think it was that person's intention where they were going out of the way. It's just they said what they said and it impacted me in the throes of that emotional distress. But I was just sitting there. I must have been praying. And within a few moments, a young gentleman came and sat next to me and shared with me how he was driving by. that all of a sudden, as he was driving by, he felt the Holy Spirit impress upon him to turn around, and he came up and he says, "What's going on?" I shared with him. He wrapped his arms around me and he says, "You know what? Mind if I pray with you? Mind if I pray with you?" There was no judgment. There was no criticism. There was no bumper sticker slogan. There was no catchphrase. It was simple, raw, and meeting me in that moment. And we prayed. And I felt comfort in that moment. I felt at peace in that moment. I still carried a lot of resentment and bitterness that I had to heal from years later. But in that moment, I felt heard. I felt validated. I felt that what I was dealing with in that moment was acknowledged. And see, people, when individuals come to us and they share with us what is going on, we are not to take it lightly. We're to sit with them. We're to listen. And I'll get into how we can do that here. But psychological today knows that spiritual abuse can be deeply damaging to a person's sense of identity, belonging, and relationship with the divine. And this is not being offended, it is experiencing emotional trauma. And the other thing is that when we look at this and understand this, church hurt is not a faith problem. It is a relational problem. When somebody feels betrayed or hurt by a pastor, by a bishop, by a Relief Society president, a youth leader, or fellow member, the injury is real. It's relational, and relational wounds affect our spiritual trust. And this is normal. This is human. This is not a sign of weak faith. And this is what we need to come to and understand. And so, what are some of the general conference talks that actually teach on this very thing? Well, let's consider Elder Garrett W. Wong from the from the most recent general conference this past October, where he acknowledges that many have been laughed at, embarrassed, but hurt, scorned, or abused. And he calls the church to be a place of healing, belonging, and welcoming. And quote, "On the dusty roads to Jericho, each of us have been laughed at, embarrassed, and hurt, perhaps scorned or abused. And with varying degrees of intent, each of us has also disregarded, not seen, or heard, or perhaps deliberately hurt others. It is precisely because we have been hurt and have hurt others that Jesus Christ brings us all to his inn. In his church and through his ordinances and covenants, we come to each other and to Jesus Christ. We love and are loved. We serve and are served. We forgive and are forgiven." And this quote comes after he shares a story of how he was brokenhearted when a young man was looking forward to becoming a deacon, and then he was laughed at by those around him because of his shoes. And it can take a simple thing like that causes somebody to experience emotional distress, to feel hurt, to feel betrayed, to feel shame, to feel guilt. And we add on to that when we say, well, the church is true, the church is perfect, but the people are not, because we're excusing away their pain. And we need to stop doing this, folks. Let's also consider Elder Peter M. Johnson from the very same October 2025 General Conference. He teaches that ministering must be done without judgment and compassion, patience, and Christ-like love. And so we need to understand that we are being called to a higher standard. We need to rise above these bumper sticker slogans, these memes, and we need to stop them. And if they are being shared, we need to confront it. We need to call it out for what it is. And we need to bring people into a place of accountability for sharing this message. And I don't care if you're a doctor, I don't care if you're a janitor working somewhere. We need to stop promoting this shaming and blaming culture that has become prominent and prevalent within our faith-based traditions and communities. Let's also consider Elder James E. Evison. Elder James C. Evison from the October 2025 General Conference emphasizes the Good Samaritan model, where we're to minister to the wounded, not lecture them. These messages align with Christ's own personal ministry. They validate a person's pain, they call for personal accountability, and reject the shame and blame that our culture seems to be inundated with. So, why does the shame culture persist? in our faith-based traditions within our faith community? Well, one thing is for certain is that it's because it's easier than accountability. If the wounded are the problem, the system does not have to change. Let me say that again. It's easier than accountability. If the wounded are the problem, the system does not need to change. And so, if those who are spiritually, emotionally, and sometimes physically wounded, the culture does not have to change. That person needs to change. Who's hurt? They're the ones that need to change. They're the ones that need to get over themselves. And I've had people say that to me, and I know that other people have had that said to them. That you just need to forgive them. You need to get over it. You need to understand that the church is perfect. The church is true, and people are just imperfect. And if you're allowing that, then your faith is not in who God is. That is not how it works, folks, and we need to seriously stop saying this. The second point of why shame and blame culture persists within our faith-based communities is because it protects power structures and egos. It protects personal pride and ego because shame keeps people quiet by invalidating and dismissing their concerns, their pain, and their reality. Who would want to come to church when they voice something that has caused distress in their lives and they are literally dismissed, it's invalidated, and in a way, what we're just saying to them is you just need to be quiet about it. We are calling them to a place of silence. And what do? They walk away. They no longer feel safe to share what's on their mind or on their hearts. They don't feel comfortable sharing any hurts that they're dealing with and they're struggling with. And eventually they end up walking away from that fellowship. And of course, they have to take accountability and responsibility like we all do. However, if we are not protecting our own ego, our own pride, and invalidating and dismissing their concerns, how much better it is for us to continue to minister to them and bring them into a deeper understanding and fellowship where they can experience the healing and forgiveness of God. The third point of the reason shame and blame culture exists within our faith based communities is that it confuses loyalty with leadership. Um, with that, because again, some believe defending the reality of others on par with defending the reality of God. So let me say that. It confuses loyalty with discipleship because many people believe in defending others, and by which they are defending God rather than addressing the personal hurt and conflict. Because it becomes more about, oh, I know that person would have never said that. You must be wrong. So, in a way, this is a soft gaslighting of that individual. And it confuses our personal loyalty, our personal sense of belonging with true discipleship. And the fourth aspect is that it really does avoid discomfort on our part. Because when it comes to listening to someone's own pain and the emotional distress, it requires humility, it requires emotional maturity, it requires empathy, and it requires spiritual maturity. And this is what Christ calls us to do with a higher understanding of what it means to come into unity and fellowship of faith. That we are to walk with them, we're to mourn with them, we are to carry them, we are to strengthen them, we are to speak into their lives comfort and healing instead of causing further harm and distress than what they are already experiencing. So let's get to some practical solutions and recommendations for this. How do we end this shaming and blaming culture that is prevalent within our faith-based communities as Latter-day Saints and Christians in general? Number one, we need to start focusing on ways to validate a person's experience. We need to say things like, I am really, that's got to be tough of what you have to deal with. That must really suck what they said. I could see how that comes across. I can understand how you may take offense to that. Or you know what? It sounds like you're really, in a lot of pain. It sounds like you're just dealing with a lot of things right now. or even just saying, you know what, I appreciate coming to me and being vulnerable and sharing this with me. Because the reality is, validation is not coming into agreement. Validation is showing compassion, is saying, I hear you, I see you. And that's all people really need, is to be heard and seen and not pushed aside, not dismissed. And when we dismiss them with catchphrases like this that are bumper sticker slogans, that's exactly what we're doing. We're dismissing them. We're dismissing their pain. We're dismissing their distress, and we're dismissing them as an individual. So, why would somebody want to bother coming back to church or continue in fellowship with people when all they feel is dismissed? They do not feel validated. They do not feel heard. They do not even feel seen. What point does it profit them to continue in fellowship when we have this toxic shame and blame culture running rampant that is not being addressed and confronted for what it is? The next thing is that we need to start listening without defending the people and the institution. We need to avoid, well, not all leaders are like that. Or you may have just maybe misunderstood what they said. Well, they probably meant very well. These statements shut people down. It silenced them. And so we listen without defending the institution. We need to avoid those statements because it doesn't do any good. It does more harm than good. The third thing is that we need to separate God from the behavior of his people. See, everything comes down to attitude and behavior, people. And this is why we need to call this out and address it and confront it and challenge it. We need to challenge the attitude and behavior that is allowing uh the permanent placeholder for the blame and the shame culture to persist in our faith-based communities. And so we need to separate God from the behavior of his people and the attitude of his people. We need to help those who are struggling, those who are distressed, those who have been hurt, who have been offended, who've been betrayed. That we need to say, hey, we see you. And we understand how this caused some offense to you, or how you are experiencing this pain. May I share with you what God dealt with in regards to how he healed me from this? So now we're bringing God into the equation and we're sharing our testimony with them. And that's where true ministry begins, folks, because we need to separate God from the behavior of his people. And then we need to encourage healthy boundaries because a lot of times healing requires where we take a step back. And sometimes it's okay to just say, you know what, I don't know how to respond to that, but I'm here with you. I'll sit with you in this moment. Because even our own presence makes more of a difference in validating them than it does by just walking away after they shared something with us. Say, well, just pray about it. Well, just keep coming to church. Well, just get into your scriptures and read. But it's like, you know what? I don't know how to address this. I don't know what to say. But let's sit. I'm here willing to listen to hear you out. So sometimes it means that we take a step back. It also means we need to take a step back and we need to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves and other people. Sometimes it's very difficult. However, I have heard that it may sometimes mean that we may have to change particular congregate. It's easy for a lot of evangelical Christians to, if it's so toxic and so prevalent, most people end up leaving one church and going to another church. However, for as Latter-day Saints, it's quite difficult for us to change wards, and that's where we need to have conversations with our ecclesiastical leaders. Sometimes it means that we just need to take a break for our own sanity and peace of mind so that we can process it through and talk with people so that we can receive healing in ministry. If it's to the point where it's so devastating that it is impacting our overall health and wellness and life, this is where we need to bring in professional counseling. We need to seek out counseling and go to the bishop and going to our pastors and say, hey, I think I need to get some help. Do you know anybody or any resources that I can plug into to help me through this? At the end of the day, boundaries are very biblical. And we need to help people understand those boundaries. Sometimes ministering to people is encouraging them to set boundaries. And I'll explain that here in a moment. And the final linchpin here, or not the final linchpin, the fifth component to this is that we need to promote accountability. We need to do better to promote it. If harm occurs, we need to report it. We need to document it. We need to seek support. We need to advocate for change because accountability is not anti church, it is Christ like. And so we need to promote more personal accountability so that we can help those who are struggling, who are suffering, who are in emotional distress, who have been hurt by the church, hurt by the people within the church, and so that we can address it and help them grow and overcome the things that they need to overcome in order for them to get to a place where they can walk in forgiveness and get over whatever it is that caused them to feel hurt and betrayed. And sometimes that takes time, and we need to understand that. And that's where we need to show grace, we need to show tender mercies, and we need to be long suffering in relationship to that. The sixth thing and the sixth aspect is that we need to walk with them, not ahead of them. So we need to meet them and walk with them, not ahead of them, because healing is a personal journey. We are not about dragging people toward God. What we are about is to walk with them. We're to walk beside them. We're to encourage them. We're to pray with them. We're to stand in intercessory with them and advocate for them sometimes if they're not even able to advocate for themselves. And so healing is a personal journey. We're not dragging people along the way or toward God. We are walking beside them in solidarity, edifying and strengthening them in the moment of their distress. And then the linchpin of all of this is that we are to, of course, model the ministry of Jesus Christ. Because when we look at Christ and how he ministered, he listened, he wept, he healed, he restored, he protected the vulnerable, and he challenged abusive leaders and abusive people. And this ought to be our pattern that we need to adopt in relationship to that. So, how do we go from changing the shame and I gave those seven key insights there. There's one additional layer that I want to add to this. And that additional layer is with regards to Matthew 18, and it is actually in verse 15 through 17. And in Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17, Christ lays out how we are to address this and confront it and minister to people in respect to this. So the first step is that we are to go to individuals privately that have caused an offense, that has maybe betrayed us, if we're able to do so safely. Um, and this is the ministry of presence because Jesus begins with the most gentle, least confrontational step. And it says here in verse 15, if your brother shall trespass against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. So we take up the matter privately with the individual that may have caused an offense. And sometimes that may look like this. You know what? As I was sharing this, I kind of felt that you were laughing at it. You were kind of putting me down, and I felt really dismissed. And that quite offended me. And I felt that that was very inappropriate because most of the time, they may not have been aware of what happened and how it impacted you. And if by going to them and you're like, hey, this is what happened, this is how it impacted me, this is how I felt, that's where the reconciliation and healing process and forgiveness process can work because it is not about cornering somebody, it is about protecting dignity, the dignity and integrity of the person, and the dignity and protecting of your uh own self and well-being. And so when a person has been hurt or offended or betrayed, the first step is to listen privately, to validate their experience, to give them space to speak without fear and avoid public exposure or gossip. And what that means is that if somebody comes to you because you said something or they perceive something and they took offense to what you said or did, listen to them, hear them out, validate their experience, give them space to speak without fear, and do not disclose it publicly or gossip about it. And what this step does is it honors the person's humility. It says, your pain matters enough for me to come to you directly, or your pain matters enough for you to bring it to my attention. And I appreciate that. And you validate that. And for those who are wounded, this is often the first moment they feel seen or heard or validated. Now, sometimes it's difficult. I get it. I understand that. Now, let's say you did go to that person privately and they gossiped about it or they exposed it or you felt invalidated. Well, the next step is this: we are to bring two or three with us. And this is the ministry of support. If private conversation does not bring clarity, safety, or resolution, Jesus adds this: take with you one or two more, because this is not about ganging up on somebody. What it is about is it's creating a safety and accountability. And so, for somebody who has been hurt, they ought to never have to face the situation alone. They may need witnesses who are able to support them and advocate for them, and to kind of be a mediator in those conversations. They need to assist people who are able to ensure a sense of fairness in those types of conversations. And sometimes it's just merely an emotional and spiritual backup. And what this step does is it protects the vulnerable and prevents manipulation, it prevents gaslighting, and it prevents a power imbalance. It says you do not have to walk into this alone. And then there's the third step. We need to bring it to the attention of those who are in leadership, and it is the ministry of accountability. Now, if the issue reaches this stage where it is not able to be resolved, we need to tell it unto the church. That doesn't mean we get up on fast and testimony meeting and we call people out and say, this person hurt me and I forgive them. Trust me, I've actually heard that happen over the years. We are causing more harm on our part because we're speaking out of our own malice and our own betrayal and our own hurts and our own resentment and bitterness. But when it says to tell it to the church, we go to those who are in leadership. In modern terms, we bring it to leaders with the authority to intervene. This is not tattling. This is not escalation for punishment. This is not running to the bishop or telling the pastor out of spite. This is about protecting the wounded. It is about addressing harmful behavior. It is about ensuring accountability. It is about preventing further damage. It is about inviting leaders to shepherd as Christ commanded. And this step recognizes that some wounds require structural support, not just personal conversation. It essentially says your healing matters enough to involve those who are able to help or those who are unable to assist. Now, here's the caveat I want to address because we need to be very mindful with this, folks. Our bishop is not a professional and licensed therapist. We are to go to him to seek godly counsel to make wise and informed decisions in order to follow through on those. And what I mean by that is we don't need to go to the bishop and say, you know what so and so said to me, and I really got offended, and they need to be punished. They need to be, they you need to convene a council and maybe disfellowship them. Um, we're speaking out of spite. What we can do, and what I've done before, is go and say, hey, I came into church, I came into this ward, and I've had to do this myself. I've came into this ward, and I came in for the first time, and I really felt like I was not welcome. I was unseen. Nobody offered a greeting. I even gone out of my way to say hello, to introduce myself, and people passed by or brushed me off. And it really bothers me, and I want to bring it to your attention. So I'm addressing the attitude and the behavior. Now, I had a situation some years ago when I first was coming back to the church, coming back to activity within the church, and I was dealing with some uh, really personal issues. It was a time when my mom had passed away. I was dealing with a lot of emotional pain with that. I was going through some really hardship and I was really struggling. I was sending messages, I was calling, I was leaving messages, and I literally got no response. And it took me writing a letter to the first presidency of the church saying that if I do not hear back from anybody in my local ward or stake, then I might as well have my name removed from the records of the church. And I sent it as an email. I didn't send it as a letter. Within a day, I received a phone call from the stake president. He came over to visit me at my office where I was working. I had just finished up with a group therapy, and we sat, and I said, "This is what is bothering me. This is what is I'm dealing with." And I have not been able to get a hold of anybody in my ward. I've tried to even call you, and I could not get anybody. Now, it was kind of a bittersweet moment because then I was able to sit with somebody, but it became bitter because he excused away the bishop. Well, the bishop is going through a lot of stuff. I said, it doesn't make any difference. Why did the elders quorum president not reach out to me? Why was I not able to have anybody come and sit with me? And I told him exactly what was going on, what's happening. He's like, oh, I didn't realize this. I said, yeah, because nobody was willing to communicate and respond back to what I was going through. So I don't, if the bishop was dealing with something, fine. But I'm talking about the whole entire leadership structure of that particular ward. And to be honest with you, that this needs to be brought up and it needs to be addressed that when a member of the ward is reaching out for help and they are ignored, what do you expect to happen with that individual? And it's like, okay, I see your point. Um, we'll take it into consideration, and then left. Fortunately, I was able to, by life circumstances, I moved out of that ward and ended up moving into another ward, which is really good. It's worked out, and my bishop and my stake president is really good. But people, these are the experiences that I've heard over the years of working with people both inside and outside of the church, that these are the examples that people are dealing with that we're just dismissing by this very mean, where it says if being hurt by the church causes you to lose faith in God, then our faith is in people. People want to be heard. They want to be valuable. They want to be validated. They want to know that they matter, that what they're going through is validated, not to agree with what they believe, but to come into alignment with understanding their hurt and their pain. Because Matthew 18 is the opposite of this means passive aggressive shaming and blaming. Because the meme says your pain is your fault, where Christ says your pain deserves care, dignity, and protection. The meme shifts blame onto the wounded, where Matthew 18 shifts responsibility towards relationship, accountability, and restoration. The meme minimizes harm, whereas Matthew exposes harm in healthy, structured way and boundaries. The meme protects person's attitudes and behaviors and ego, where Matthew 18 protects those who are being hurt, who are offended, who are ostracized, who are betrayed. So, for those who are listening, if you've been hurt by the church, I want you to hear this. Your hurt is very real and valid. It is not a sign of your weak faith. It is a sign that something sacred was violated. And if we want people to rediscover God, if we want people to be reconciled, if we want people to come back to church, we need to first show them the love of God and the love of Christ through us, through our example. We need to end the shaming and blaming culture with this meme. We need to validate those who are wounded. We need to minister like Christ. And we need to understand and appreciate people who come to us and say, you know what, that really sucks of what happened to you. What can I do to help you? How am I able to help you? And if they say, all I want is to be heard, then let them be heard and validate. And then bring it up. You know, we have an accountability and a responsibility to minister to people. We are to bring one another into the unity of faith where we're strengthening them, encouraging them, edifying them, and walking with them to in the process of healing and forgiveness and even in repentance. And folks, let's be honest. We need to do a lot of repenting by using these bumper sticker slogans ourselves. And I'm just as guilty of it too, because I find myself sometimes falling into the trap of saying that. And I've worked very hard to be mindful about this, where I move away from saying this. And that's what we need to do is we need to move away from these bumper sticker slogans and catchphrases. And we need to start healing our communities. We need to start recognizing those who are hurt. We need to start ministering to them the way Christ ministered. And then we're going to walk with them and encourage them and edify them and strengthen them. And whenever somebody uses these catchphrases, we need to call them out right there on the spot and say, you know what? That's not true. Let's not go down that road, because all you're doing is you're perpetuating shame and guilt. And that's not what we're about here. Because until we confront this attitude and behavior that's prevalent within our faith based communities, it's going to continue. With that said, I leave you my testimony that when we truly minister the way Christ taught us to minister, the way scriptures lay out, we can bring people back to faith. We can bring people into a place of healing. We can bring comfort and peace to those who are suffering and are emotionally distressed. Because I've experienced it, and I know other people have experienced it. Let us all press forward with steadfast faith through Jesus Christ, because of the seed that lives through us, not that we live according to our own will and purpose. In Jesus' name, amen.